extending a very warm, welcome and a very good afternoon to all the people who've joined in for the session today. In furtherance of our Founders 101 series, we decided to get in and bring about an interesting topic on directors' duties and responsibilities to you this afternoon. I think all of you are amply aware of how important is it to understand, since all of you go as directors on the board and you also have investors who come in asking for board seats. So it is important for all of you as founders to understand what are the duties and obligations that are pinned onto you when you step onto the board of your companies, and what are the obligations and rights that you can offer as when your investors ask for a board seat. Just to begin the session on that note, a director, essentially, who is a director? A director is essentially a part of a collective body of directors called the board, which is responsible for the superintendence, control and direction of the affairs of the company. Under common law rules, directors' duties are largely derived from the law of agency and the law of trusts. Under the law of agency, a director has upon himself duties of skill, care, and diligence. And on the other hand, when we talk of law of trusts, it basically imposes the fiduciary duties on the directors, which is to be responsible to the company at large, to the board at large. Accordingly, directors are the trustees of the company's money and property, and they also act as agents in the transaction when they enter into or on behalf of the company. They can be liable for as trustees for breach of trust if they misapplied the funds or they commit breach of bylaws of the company. Therefore, a director is expected to perform his duties as a reasonably diligent person having the knowledge, skill, and experience, both as a person carrying out the director's function and that of a person himself. So a director essentially can play various roles in the company. It could be that of an agent, an employee who's appointed on the roles of the company, an officer, or a trustee of the company. Now, when we talk about the legislations in India around, which codify the director's duties and responsibilities, the first legislation and the most important legislation that comes to our minds is the Companies Act 2013, which basically, clarifies in some and also in some sense enlarges the ambit of duties and responsibilities of the directors. And when I say enlarge, I'm basically referring and comparing the existing Companies Act 2013 to the Companies Act of 1956. The provisions which are embodied in the Companies Act 2013 with respect to the duties and responsibilities of the directors, including the independent directors, not only provide for greater certainty to the directors regarding their conduct and responsibilities, thereby ensuring better and impeccable corporate governance and management, but they also go ahead and enable and empower the beneficiaries, the regulators, the courts, and the likes involved to judge, regulate, and control the activities and obligations of a director more objectively and effectively. That's how we've seen the legislation panning out. And to discuss this further, we have an excellent panel where we have Hetal, who's a senior member of our corporate compliance team, and she takes care of the corporate compliances of a lot of startups that are that are on board with us in terms of our clientele as well as other entities. And we have Kamran, who has seen both in terms of the advising the clients on the duties and responsibilities, as well as fighting in a court of law for in relation to disputes which have arisen out of those duties and responsibilities. And with that note, let me just start the panel today. And my first question is directed to Hetal. Hetal, so what are the types of directors appointed on the boards of the Indian entity? And is there a legal distinction between the powers and duties of, let's say, an executive director and a non-executive director? Maybe, from a startup perspective, if you could just clarify to the audience on these two bits.
Sure. Thanks, Harshita, and good afternoon to everyone. Am I audible well to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. So in relation to the types of director, there are various type of directors identified under the Companies Act that an Indian company is likely to appoint on its board during its lifetime. And the composition of the board is usually decided basis three aspects. One is the type of the entity it is, like private or a public limited company, minimum and a maximum number of directors, and basis the threshold limits like paid up capital or turnover of the company as specified under the Companies Act for certain certain specified conditions. So such directors would be either a managing director, a whole-time director, nominee director, independent director, woman director, small shareholder director, alternate director, additional, and resident director. So these are the nomenclatures given to the directors. And however, to broadly, all of these directors would be categorized mainly under two buckets. It's executive director and the non-executive director. So executive director is a defined term under the Companies Act. He or she is a person who is a director as well as a whole-time employee of the company, whether being designated by the company as an executive director or not. So executive directors, being the whole-time employee of the company, they are deeply involved in the day-to-day operations of the company, whereas non-executive directors largely only participate in the decision making at the board level. So the whole time directors, managing directors, and any other employee directors are usually considered as the executive directors, whereas independent directors and the nominee directors are considered as non executive directors, as they are not in the employment of the company but they participate in the decision making at the board level. So, to answer your question, lastly, as to if there is a legal distinction between the powers and duties of executive versus non-executive director, the answer is absolutely no. But we cannot deny the fact that both these categories have a different roles to play, when they are onboarded on the board of the directors. So, while we will move ahead with the session, we will be looking more at the duties and responsibilities in details. However, the classic proposition of the law is that all directors, once been appointed on the board of any Indian entity, whether executive, non-executive, on startups or any of the other entities, they are equally responsible, and the fiduciary duty towards the company for both categories remains same. Over to you, Harshita.
Thank you, Hetal. And I think just to add on in terms of the distinction between executive and non-executive, and why and where does it really gain importance in the context of startups. So essentially, just to explain a little more granular, the executive directors and the whole-time directors are usually the directors which are the promoter directors or the promoter nominated members on the board. The non-executive directors or those who are not in the employment of the company are the director seats which are usually given to the investors who are coming in or any advisory, a person who's looking for an advisory role and may step onto your board mainly for strategic direction and guidance. And that's where you offer them a non-executive board or in a non-executive seat. So executive, director, and why it should assume importance for you guys as promoters is because you have to be running the show for the company. You are front running and implementing all the decisions of the company. So tomorrow, if there is something which goes wrong in the company, while there is no legal distinction in terms of roles and responsibilities between executive and non-executive, the first hook which will go on to is on the executive, and then comes the non-executive. So that's where the distinction really becomes helpful for you to understand why executive and non-executive. Uh, over to you, Kamran. With the flow, what are the duties and responsibilities of the directors in other acts? How does the liability get determined under law? You've been involved in many case laws, etc., where you've seen the liability of the directors or cases coming out of liability of the directors. So how have you seen that angle and that aspect of the director duties?
Right. Thanks, Harshita. Welcome everybody tuned in. Let me just begin by talking about a little bit on the duties of directors. And when we talk about duties of directors, we have to look at the Companies Act of 2013. India, by passing the Companies Act 2013, has introduced a provision in law which actually codifies the duties that were there for directors under common law. And that provision is basically Section 166 of the Companies Act. And it basically provides several duties or imposes several duties on all types of directors without making any distinction. And basically, some of those duties are to act in accordance with the articles of the company, to act in good faith in the best interest of the company, shareholders, community at large, employees, and also protect environment. They also have a duty to act with due skill, care, and diligence. There's also a duty to avoid any kind of direct or indirect conflict. There's also a duty to, avoid or give undue gain or advantage to, relatives and partners. So all these kind of duties are now codified under law. Now, when we think about how the duties or how the responsibility or a liability is fastened on the directors, I think this can be broken down into three parts. Now, number one is how can criminal liability be fastened on a director? And number two is how can liability and in other statutes be fastened on a director. And when we talk about criminal law, the law is quite straightforward. And it says that the director has to be directly linked with the act that we are complaining. And also there needs to be some intent or mens rea or a malicious intent angle, which needs to be attributed to the director in order to hold him criminally liable. So, a recent example in this case was a case of Supreme Court in Shiv Kumar Jatia judgment, where in one of the where one of the managing directors who was not even in India and who was not in charge of the formulating policies and all of that, he was charge sheeted. There was an FIR filed against him as well, and the court ultimately held that the director has to be linked to the act which is being complained of as having been contravened, and there needs to be a malicious intent or a guilty intent on the part of the director to hold him criminally liable, and basis these grounds the court quashed the FIR against that particular director. Now when we come to how the liability gets fastened when it is specified in a statute, that basically is comes out of two different, actually in three different ways. One is Companies Act itself. Now, under Companies Act, for violation of most of your provisions, it is actually the officer in default who is liable. And when we talk about officer in default is basically any key managerial person, any director who was responsible to ensure compliance, any person who in accordance with whose instructions the board is accustomed to act, and there are one or two more listed persons who are deemed to be officer in default. And for most violations, Companies Act says that the officer in default is liable. And secondly, and for some provisions, the Companies Act actually specifies the individual who are to be held liable. So, for example, your financial statements, if there is any contravention in relation to such provisions, it's the director in charge of finance who will be liable. Now, there is a separate category of vicarious liability provisions which are provided in various statutes such as FEMA, SEBI Act, Negotiable Instruments Act, and that basically provides that at the time the contravention took place, the person who was in charge of and responsible for the affairs of the company and conduct of the business will be held liable. Now, how did the court actually ascertain who was the person in charge of and responsible for the affairs of the business or the conduct of the business of the company? Again, because there was no guidance here, the courts basically go back to the concept of officer in default, and they basically draw a parallel over here, saying that since Companies Act basically provides officer in default, who are basically the people responsible for all the compliances, they are basically can be held to be deemed to be in charge of or responsible for the affairs of the company. And that is how like for example in section 141 of Negotiable Instruments Act, if there is any contravention that is complained of, then we will have to look at who were the persons in charge of, and which basically directs you into the concept of officer in default, and you will have to the liability will get determined like that. Thirdly, the liability gets determined when the statute specifically provides for a specific person to be liable. So, for example, in a Factories Act and the Shops and Establishment Act, it basically provides that the person who has been designated as the occupier. Now, no matter where the contravention happened, who was responsible for, the moment a occupier is designated, it is the occupier or that particular director who will be responsible or liable for all the contraventions under the Factories Act or Shops and Establishments Act. Over to you, Harshita.
Thank you, Kamran. Thank you. That was very helpful to understand. And I think just on that note on officers in default, which Kamran also rightly pointed out, apart from the Companies Act, there are various other laws in which you are There are various other laws in which you are required to actually notify to the authorities who is going to be your officer in default. For example, and one of the common examples that I can think of right now is the labor laws. So when you're filling up those details and submitting it to the labor authorities, please be very careful in terms of whom are you nominating, because the officer in default or the occupier in premise, as Kamran was pointing out, is going to be the person who's going to be responsible for what happened. Should a default happen tomorrow. So just be very careful in terms of nominating, whether it's going to be the promoter or it's going to be a key managerial person. You have to be very careful in terms of giving the names there. Over to you, Hetal. Back to you in terms of, now that we've understood the differentiation between an executive, non-executive, full-time, not in the employment of the company, director, and the roles and responsibilities that are pinned under various acts on them. Why does it really matter to have a structured governance on board? And what should a board, an ideal board, really look like?
Sure. Thanks, Archita. So, one second. Yeah. So, as you've already mentioned earlier, that ultimately it is the board who is responsible and liable for making the critical decisions for the company, like whether to raise money, whether to be acquired, whether you want to enter into any important strategic transaction, or whether you want to hire or fire any senior personnel or management. So typically, with each round of investment, startup or the companies also agree for certain preemptive rights for the investors, including a board seats, as some investors will attach a board seat to their terms of investments. Hence, it is critical to check who presides over the board and important to ensure that these major decisions are made by the people who are knowledgeable about the company, the business, its core value, the fundamental value of the company, its business, and the industry in which it operates. So, definitely having a strong board, with the expert advisors is highly valuable to the founder, as they can help with the appropriate guidance and the support on various range of issues which are material to the business and the company in their growing years. Hence, overall, with every new investment, it is equally important to structure your board strategically, because we have been seeing a lot of boardroom wars, these days within the unicorn fraternities. To answer your second questions as to what usually a startup boards look like, or what has been the standard approach, so answer to that would be like, the composition of board is likely to evolve over period of time, and it varies from companies to company. And yeah, definitely the standard approach for the startups do exist, but it really depends on the stage, at what stage of funding the company is. For example, at a very nascent stage for the startups, the board would usually comprise of the founder or the promoter directors. But as you move on with the different series of your funding rounds, and with onboarding of the strategic investors in your entity, the combination keeps on changing, and basis the right given to such investors, you will have a combination of the founder promoter directors, investor nominee directors, independent directors, as may have been pre-agreed, during your transaction documentation in SHA and SP. So to ensure that the founding team, along with the funding team, so founding team would still want to remain in control of the board. There is usually a seat reserved for the promoter directors or the founder directors, and the investor nominee directors would come into picture as and when the lead investors, are brought on board into the company. And as you move ahead with the further rounds of financing, it is fairly common nowadays to also designate one seat as an independent seat, which means that they would also want to have a independent director on their board. And such person is typically not an investor or the founder or an employee of the company, but he or she would be someone having industry knowledge and valuable contacts, and potentially serves as a role of tiebreaker or a neutral umpire in case of any deadlocks between the investor and the founders. Lastly, at some point of time, if the board is getting too big, or if the investment size really does not merit a seat on the board, so instead of handing out more board seats, the company would want to allow investors to appoint board observers. Okay. Board observers can come in and participate in the board meetings, but they do not get a formal vote. They are not directors, and therefore they are not subject to the directors' duties and the liabilities. So at times over the period of time, the later investors become observers, and and sometimes the earlier investors may become observers. So this equation will keep on changing as and when various stages the startup goes through its growth phase. So in fact, Harshita, it would be helpful if you could also add more on how actually the startup boards get structured from the perspective of the investment sizes. Over to you,
Sure.
Harshita.
Sure. So, as we have seen, when the term sheets are signed, the investors are usually looking for a board seat. Many a times, what we have seen is that depending on the stage at which the term sheet is signed, the founders generally, go with the presumption that there has to be a board seat which is given. So, to add on to what Hetal is, to take you back to what Hetal was saying, which is that look at the investment size and whether it corroborates or warrants a board seat or not, instead of just assuming that the investor coming in with whatever pool of money should be given a board seat. So let's say an investor who's coming in with a 2% or a 3% capital into the company may or may not warrant a board seat. While a lot will depend on how you negotiate it with your investor, during the term sheet stage. From a promoter standpoint, it will always be helpful if you do not give away board seats at a 2% or a 3% or a really insignificant shareholding. The other point is that once you have given away a board seat to, let's say, an investor, be very careful in your investment agreements to bring about a threshold below which the board seat is going to fall away. While the observe again, let's say that the investor is coming in at an investment of 10% or above, and that may be your first formal round of financing which is coming in. You are setting the precedent. Your documents today will set the precedent and the base for all your future rounds of financing. So today you need to agree that, I'm giving you a board seat at 10%, but let's say tomorrow when you fall below a 7.5 or below 5%, your board seat also falls away. So this will ensure that you're not setting the wrong precedent for further future incoming investors. Because if somebody is coming at, let's say, 4% tomorrow, he shouldn't be asking for a board seat, or somebody coming at below the threshold shouldn't be asking you for a board seat there. So very important to articulate, and depending on how your composition looks like, on specifying a percentage below which the board seat may fall off. The second point, I think the Hetal clearly mentioned that while the investors have a board seat, they may or may not ask for an observer seat as well. Just to bring out the differentiation between having a board seat and having an observer seat, while the board, both the seats or both the positions essentially have access to all the documents, notices, records, agendas, papers that the board gets. The director has a right to vote in the meeting, and the observer does not have the right to vote. So he'll be a participant who will be there sitting in the board meetings, watching out the proceedings, and not being able to vote. So that's the difference that is there. Which you again, so depending on where how your investment is structured and what are you looking at in terms of value coming from the investors, you can either negotiate for a board seat and or an observer seat. So that again brings out another important point that you should be careful on when you're agreeing to to board composition with your new investors. I think that those were the 2 points, or 2, 3 points from my end, and I think I'll move it back to Kamran from here. And a couple of questions, Kamran, in terms of what we've been seeing. First is, can the directors act in the interest of its nominating shareholder only? Or does it have to be a fiduciary responsibility where the director is going to be responsible to the board at large, to the company at large? And how can a director show that he's acted with skill, care, and diligence? I mean, if you can give some examples.
Right. So, very pertinent question, Harshita, over there. We oftentimes we understand that if a director is nominated by a shareholder or an institution, then he has to act. He's only acting for or in the interest of that particular institution. However, Companies Act actually makes no such distinction. It basically provides the duties of directors, and the duties of directors are applicable on all kinds of directors, whether nominee or whole-time director, whether he is an executive director or a non-executive director. Now, talking about whether a director can promote the interest of a shareholder or a nominee, uh, not really, because director has to promote the interest of the company, its shareholders and members as a whole. And then when we go back and look at 166 of the Companies Act, it actually imposes an obligation to promote the interest of even the employees, to look after the interest of even the community at large, and the environment. And therefore, the answer to that will be no, Harshita. The directors will have to actually take care and promote the interest of the company as a whole. Now, the question as to how a director can be shown to have acted with skill, care, and diligence, it depends on for example, in the cases that have come before the courts, it is always it has always depended on the facts of that case that were presented. And one of the landmark judgments that in this regard was the P.A. Tendulkar case of the Supreme Court in 1978, where the Supreme Court actually clarified that a director has to always act reasonably and honestly and with due diligence. But and how he can be shown to have acted with due diligence and skill, care, and diligence, the test for that is, Harshita, is that he cannot shut his eyes to what must be obvious to everyone else. He cannot uh, he cannot look the other way. He cannot act in a way which will enable the fraud in the company in the first place. So this was the test which was laid down. And then when we look at the common law generally at large, we see that again this is the test which keeps getting followed by different courts, that uh, if there is a red flag issue which came up before the board and that red flag issue was missed, and I'm going to talk about what those red flags could be for everybody's benefit. If there was a red flag, that red flag was ignored, then the director has not acted with due skill, care, and diligence. Now the question, a very simple question to that would be, can a director delegate some duties to other people who are better placed to take a judgment call on such things, for example financial statements, for example. So the answer to that, the courts have said that a directors, they can rely upon audit committees, they can rely upon different committees, but they cannot not question them if there are red flags. If there is a financial statement and if there is a qualified auditor report, then the director, that is a red flag issue, and the director has to question the management as to why there is a qualification by the auditors. Now, what could those red flags be? Let me talk about a case where it was before Supreme Court. It was a listed company, and the directors were actually were being prosecuted for having failed to act with due skill, care, and diligence. And what were the red flags that the Supreme Court said that they should have looked at, but they ignored? Now, in the profits of the company, there was definitely fictitious profit that was being reported in the financial statements. So the director, the Supreme Court held that the profit of the company in one quarter versus the next quarter just tripled. That was a one really glaring red flag that the director should have picked up, but they never picked up. Again, the profits, the revenues just suddenly increased, and it exponentially increased within the next 2-3 quarters, which again should have been a red flag issue for the directors to pick up and ask the management how and why and where is this money coming from, but they never did. And that, the Supreme Court held, was the red flag. Now, to take a very common example and a very well-known case of Satyam, what happened in Satyam? Satyam, basically the management duped everybody, the board, the auditors, everybody. And basically what was happening in Satyam was that there were fictitious accounts, fictitious invoices that were being created by the management. They were systematically being introduced in the system, and there was fictitious income being shown in the books of accounts, and there was interest. Once the fictitious income is being shown in the books of account, there was tax that was being, the real tax that was being paid on the fictitious income. So all of this, were the red flags, can be held to be the red flags, but in Satyam's case, what happened was that the management, continuously kept all of these facts hidden from the directors, and they continuously kept, posing a very rosy picture of the financial statements. That is why it could happen at that scale. Another red flag could be that if your internal systems are, working in place and they are working fine, if there is any, a report of the auditor highlighting issues with the internal systems, internal audit systems, then I think the directors should, it becomes a red flag issue for directors and ask the question, and the director have to ask questions to the management as to why all of this is happening in the company. Over to you, Ashita.
Sure. So, Kamlan, just on that point around acting in with due diligence and acting with reasonable care, etc. So, a lot of times, what we have seen clients coming back and asking is, what if the director omitted to do a particular thing? So, maybe the differentiation around, or maybe the linkage between act or omission to do certain things. So, have you seen cases around where the director may not have acted, let's say, diligently, but probably omitted to act diligently also? So, are the cases, or do the courts also rule or hold the directors liable in cases they omit to act diligently?
That's correct. That's correct, Harshita. In fact, in the Samira Theatres case, what happened was that the directors were found to have overlooked
That's
the
right.
financial statement, and they've not actually, they've omitted to ask questions. They've omitted to, and that the court held was where they went, where they lagged in due skill, care, and diligence. When the financial statements were put before them, they would have to analyze the statement, ask questions.
That's
Failing
right.
to ask question also, is an omission of a sort, and therefore can be held to be, in breach of your skill, care, and diligence duty to the company.
That's right. So I think that's very important, and that was an excellent point, Kamran, you brought about, because it's not just about acting on an explicit, way where you have exercised or not exercised care or diligence, but it's also about omitting to do certain things. As simple as omission to ask questions on the financial statements which have been submitted to you could also lead to, lead to you being held in default by the courts. So there has to be a lot of care, and which is why the terms care, due diligence, etc., have been used by the courts in various judgments, to reiterate the importance. So it's not just, and so you as a promoter director in the company have to be extremely careful in terms of every step, every document that has been submitted to you, everything that is run past you must actually be, be read with a very minute lens, so that you do not act or omit to act in the way it is, you as a director are expected to. Um, we'll just quickly take up a few questions before we move on to, to the panelists again. Some of the questions, and we'll start with Ishan. I think, can an investor, through the investment agreements, appoint an independent director in consultation with the company? The answer is yes, and I think we also discussed. So the independent director, the investor can ask for a right to be consulted, when an independent director is appointed on the board. So that depends on how you're negotiating your documents. The second question, and Kamran and Hital, please feel free to pitch in on whatever question you want to pick up. What is the difference between a director being shareholder or not shareholder, and how does it affect the director's duties and conflict? So I think, Kamran, you may want to pick it up because you've already touched upon the subject.
Right. Again, like I said, there is actually the Companies Act does not make any distinction between, a shareholder, nominee director, or a normal director. The difference at best can be an executive versus non-executive. In Companies Act under Section 149, subsection 12, there is a safe harbor provision for non-executive directors, and which basically protects the non-executive directors and holds them liable only for such contraventions which have taken place with their knowledge or active knowledge or connivance through board process. So that basically means that if you are a non-executive director, you have to be very careful when you're sitting on the board of the company, because board processes are important, and knowledge can be attributed to non-executive directors through board process. So that may be the distinction between executive and non-executive, Harshita.
Sure, and I think also to answer the point, if the question was hinted around director being a shareholder or not a shareholder, so it wouldn't really matter if the director is holding shares or not. The moment you're appointed on the board of the company, then your classification is not is nothing to do with whether you are a shareholder or not. So it'll, again, as Kamran said, it'll only be whether you're an executive or a non-executive, and that will determine what your duties and interests are going to be. I think there's another question by the same person about how different are the obligations of directors from an independent director appointed under law. So Hital, you may want to pick up some of the common duties of independent directors and liabilities that are pinned onto independent directors.
So, Harshita, as we discussed earlier, see, there is no different obligation from the ID appointed under the law. So, while the startups or the companies basically, this is more applicable to the private companies who, under the law, do not need to have appoint independent director on board. But there are two school of thoughts revolving around this concept when private company appoints an independent director. So it someone may take a view that the provisions are not provisions of ID is not applicable to the private limited company. But if you ask my personal view, it's like you cannot have a selective approach when you want to have someone as an ID on your board. uh, Another thing is that as far as disclosures under listed or the as applicable to the private public companies is concerned, yeah, there may be some slight deviation being taken from that, but in terms of the obligations, no, you definitely cannot take that risk. The reason is that you are being appointed on the board to act in your independent capacity.
Sure. I think I'll take up the next question by Jayesh in terms of DNO insurance policies to protect the director's liabilities. So yes, that's a very prevalent and common phenomena that we've been seeing in documents now with startups and investors, that the investors usually insist on a DNO policy which covers all the directors at large. So executive and non-executive same, but the DNO policy, I think depending on what amount you agree for the DNO coverage with your investor, that is certainly going to be a little useful to you in terms of your liabilities, covering you for your liabilities.
Just to add here on DNO, insurance, Harshita, we've seen in the past, what kind of DNO policy work and not work, and it all basically depends on how well your DNO policy is negotiated. And some of the key terms of DNO policy that can be negotiated are, first of all, the kind of claims that are covered. Sometimes the DNO policy do not cover claims made by Directorate of Enforcement under FEMA. Maybe that can be negotiated. Sometimes they say that if the past violations or any summons or any ongoing inquiry was not disclosed at the time of entering into the DNO insurance, then that proceedings will not get covered. Sometimes they try and limit the coverage through time, that if you've come to know about some allegation which is made against you and you've not reported it within a certain period of time, then you do not get covered under the DNO. So these are some of the aspects that can be negotiated with the insurance well in advance, so that there is no problem in the future if and when the claim arises.
To take up the next one, I think, can you give examples of at what percent should a board seat normally be given, 5, 10, or 15? So that's, again, it's a negotiated contract between you and your investor in terms of what they're looking at. There is no set standard. There have been cases in which board seats have also been given on a 5% threshold or a lesser threshold. But again, it depends on the capital that you're getting and depends on the stage at which you're getting that capital in and your ability to negotiate with your investor on the table. So there is no set standard around it. But having said that, once let's say you've got in an investor at a 10% or more threshold, or at an investor who's at 10% or more invested in, and you've given him a board seat, it's always advisable, as I mentioned earlier, to put a following threshold for the director seat, let's say at 5% or a 7.5%. That is a common phenomena that we've seen across. And especially when you're giving away a board seat at earlier stages, which is in your seed or a series A stage. The question by Albert DeCosta, I think it will primarily depend on what your contract stays, which is, in real estate development companies, do the courts hold the directors responsible for project delays? I'll take a dig at it, and I'll probably hand it over to Kamran also in terms of how the courts have perceived, real estate companies in particular. But I think it has to be viewed, in the context of the contract that you've signed up to, in the context of how and what has really caused the delays. So it's not a very objective answer to give whether it is a yes or a no, and it will have to be determined, basis a reading of the facts and circumstances of your case. But Kamran, over to you if you have any anything to add here specifically from a court standpoint?
Right, Harshita. So when we talk about real estate, I think the most prominent statute which comes to mind is RERA, and RERA again has a vicarious liability provision, which basically provides for that if at the time the contravention took place, persons who were in charge of and responsible for the conduct of the business will be held to be liable, or people who with whose active connivance the offense had occurred. So when we will look at it, we will actually look at how involved this director was in the functioning of the company, how responsible, what all responsibilities did this director have, and and that basically those facts will basically determine whether this director will be held to be liable for the violation under the act or not.
Sure. Hetan, you may want to pick on the next question around applicability in a Section 8 company. And is there something different we see in terms of Section 8 companies?
No, so in terms of board composition, not really. So Section 8 would go, in accordance with the private limited companies. So you really don't have any specific exceptions over there.
Okay. I think we've already covered the bit on DNO and what is covered, what not, and how you can negotiate it at best. Unless you have anything more to add here, Kamran, I'll move on to the next one.
Just 2 points further to add on the DNO insurance. I think one is very key aspect of DNO insurance is that you should always retain control over your choice of attorney, and that you should be able to appoint whoever lawyer you feel like appointing, who can best represent your interest before any court. And secondly, there are policies which basically provides that upon there should be a final determination of fraud. And until there is a final determination of fraud, all of the liabilities, all of the expenses will be covered. Typically, if there is a claim of fraud, most insurance policies will try and exclude that. But that again will come back to how well it is negotiated with the insurance.
Okay. The next question, I think, I'll pick it up on what kind of protections are really available to an investor director, given they're not involved in the day-to-day business activities, and maybe throw some light on the liabilities of a board observer. Okay, so again, it's mostly contractually driven on what you agree with your investor directors. However, what we've seen across the board for startups and companies of this size is that the investor director is essentially under the contract not liable for any failure or default, or act or omission of any kind, because that's how they agree to it. They are only going to be strategizing and helping you in terms of your big ticket matters, I would say, and not get involved in the day-to-day operations, which is run by you. So tomorrow, if an issue comes up in terms of a situation where the company is held liable for a default in day-to-day operations, it's going to be the promoter directors who are going to be pinned against. Also, as we mentioned, which is there is a specific clause that the investors typically agree for in the documents, which says that in no circumstances can the investor director be liable or be held as an officer in default, occupier in premise, etc., for the purposes of any law whatsoever. So it's a broad clause which is overarching and covers not just the Companies Act but labor laws and other provisions as well. So if you ask me, under a contract, the investor director is essentially not liable for anything that can really go wrong with the company. And again, and Kamran can again throw light on situations where it has come to that, where we had to prove that the investor director was held liable or what did not exercise caution and prudence in terms of his exercise of his duties as an investor director. But largely, I think the liability usually hinges in I would say not in favor of the promoter directors. So that is how it works for them. In terms of liabilities of a board observer, nothing really, because as I mentioned, there is no act or an express role that an observer really plays on your board. It is only a role to where it receives information, maybe processes that and passes it on to the investor without having the ability to vote. So there's no liability that really attaches to a board observer in that sense. Next one is voting the only way to remove a director? So I think usually the common resorted way to remove a director is the person nominating the director has a right to pull him or her back. So that's the common way to remove, and that's how it works. And they get a new replacement of the director who's removed.
So just to add to that, Harshita, so if the question is more specific, if the removal of director by the shareholders, so yes, company can remove the director by members' approval unless such directors have been appointed by central government or any tribunal.
Helpful. I think just before we take up the other few questions, maybe we can just go back, and I think one of the questions also hinges on the same, which is, and this is a question both to Kamran and Hetal in terms of, the crisis that we are all in, the COVID crisis. Are there any key considerations that should be kept in mind by the board? Any do's and don'ts from a COVID situation perspective?
Right. Hital, you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, so I'll just give some thoughts and maybe you can, add to it. So say, since everyone is now well acquainted as to how the economic turndown has happened due to the COVID, and corporates and businesses are facing different challenges during this crisis. Some businesses have been reaching new level of growth with the new opportunities coming in, like, right, we have been seeing that there have been mass productions of PPE kits and all, while some others are struggling to survive. So, as the executive management of the companies are busy in the day-to-day handling of this crisis, the question comes to the mind is as to what are the board's responsibility during this crisis? Is it over and above what you have been doing till date? This is the questions directors should clearly understand quickly because after this pandemic ends, while examining the significant financial losses across global or across industries, stakeholders and investors will be asking the first inevitable question that where was the board? What did board do to mitigate the losses or any actions, where they were supposed to act diligently. So there is no one size fit all answers as to what board should do in this situation and what not. Uh, but some there would be some key considerations which a board, for any entity should consider, and they should be thinking strategically about the gradual business resumption because that's the priority right now, and also ensure that the decisions taken by the management are in line with the culture and core values of the organization, and they should also provide the practical inputs and give practical independent insights to the situation wherever they can. So just to add some pointers as to what they should be doing it is that first try and understand the impact of the company's operations, including the risk arising from the COVID. What are the measures which consult with your management as to where are the risk which is, or the places where this crisis has hit most to your operations. There should be a proper communication process between the management and the board to also receive the regulatory updates, impact on the business and the measures being taken if this has not been a general process for the companies. Because it becomes very important that board and the management together should communicate frequently with the applicable regulators and other government agencies for seeking guidance as to various aspects of the regulatory disclosures, relaxations, governance norms being issued by them from time to time in lieu of dealing as to with this crisis. One is to retain the good governance reporting practice as required under the various laws like SEBI, ROC, MCA, right? And in terms of other things that as what you can do to retain your business in line. Uh, as far as commercial contracts are concerned, you may take a chance to review your critical contracts, and effect of COVID, including the force majeure clause, in terms of the enforcement, which is crucial from your company's perspective and also the counterparty's perspective, like investors, in terms of some missed milestones, as may have been pre-agreed during this time when those could not have happened. So it's important that you reevaluate these contracts or reevaluate your position as to what can be done and try to evolve a win-win situation wherever possible. And you may also evaluate opportunities, which have been made available by the change circumstances. This example which I gave about the massive industry evolving for PPE kits, which was not the India's domain earlier. So something like this can evolve, and definitely board should have a look at it. Uh, try to understand the impact on the liquidity and the financing arrangement, right? So there may be some dividend payment due, interest payments, right, in terms of loans and borrowings being taken, compensation payments. So there's going to be a lot of distortion in this payments and overall your finance arrangement. So because of no continued business or meager revenues during the entire period. So it's important that you have a look at your finance and liquidity crunch, whatever is going into place, and renegotiate with your creditors, lenders, investors as may be required. Try to look out. For some avenues, or even try to check whether company is able to access any government funds or the schemes or the programs which have been initiated by the government of India, which has been made available to support the economy due to this COVID-19. Have open communication with your stakeholders, external worlds, as to how your business has been doing, what you have been trying to do, because all of a sudden it should not be, kind of a surprise as to things which could have been managed earlier or better have not been taken care at all. One of the important aspects which board should also do is take a stock of the human resources, and safety concerns for the employees is also priority in consideration of the lot of furloughs and jobless situation has occurred due to this. Parallelly, also understand the technology security is needed, and the bandwidth for the employments in the situation that your employees are able to work from home, as this may lead to altogether a different liability issue in terms of the cyber security concerns. So it's very important that you also check as to what the company, what the management has been doing to address those, and give your inputs wherever you can. Lastly, I think it's very important to have your trusted advisors and the external counsel, on board for any emergency advisory you may need, to and fro in terms of what needs to be done in regulatory aspect, which changing to handle the situation. It's very important that you also take a conscious call. All in all the decisions which are being taken by the board, they should be focused on maximizing the shareholders value. Not only shareholders, the entire stakeholders who are associated with the companies, your employees, your lenders, creditors, investors, obviously within the ambit of law and to the best of the business acumen and the existing situation. I think that's how a board should look at. And over to you, Kamran, to add any more insights to it.
No, completely agree with you, Hetal. Just to highlight one point, now under the 2013 Companies Act, under Section 166, the directors also have a duty, not only towards just the members or shareholders. They have a duty to promote the interest of employees, communities, and environment at large. So that basically widens the scope of the responsibility that the directors have to play. And in times like these, we may also have to be careful about what the impact your company is making, or the operations of the company is making on the community at large and on your employees at large. Over to you, Harshita, if you have any comments.
Thanks, Hital and Kamran. I think that was helpful to understand and answer some of the questions of the attendees in terms of what are the other duties that are pinned upon, or is there something special that they need to be careful about in these COVID times? Just to take up the last few questions, some of which I responded in the chat. Is a so okay, so another question that I'll just take up is, if a director joins in a company as an intrapreneur, which is with a sweat equity element, what is the liability of such director? So, when a director is joining the company more from a strategic assistance or a guidance perspective, he will more likely than not agree on a non-executive position. And which is where I think we've highlighted enough in terms of the fact that the non-executive director is, in terms of liability, he ranks second and comes after the executive directors. So, and he may also agree in a contract with you to say that he's not going to be liable for a lot of actions or any liabilities or any defaults that occur in the company. So he is going to be in a non-executive position, and which is where, again, your negotiation or your ability to strike a deal with him in terms of what his duties would be, what his obligations would be in the contract is going to be very crucial. Hidal, there's another question for you. which is what are the what are the ways to shield a managing director and the personal assets in case of company liabilities? Yeah.
I think Kamran would want to pick that up.
Yeah, and
Well,
I think Kamran, if you could also highlight,
Yeah,
when
he's
you're
already
picking
there.
that. So Kamran,
shielding
if you could
managing
also.
directors, I not be a managing director at all. That way.
And I think Aman, if you could also highlight, any specific situation that you've come across where the personal liabilities have actually, personal assets have been pulled in. So another, just before Kamran begins, I think just a note of caution: when you agree with your, investment documents, in terms of your liability as a promoter director or your liability as a promoter towards the investor, be very careful to carve out personal assets from that document. Many a times, what we have seen is that when you're agreeing to agreeing with a documentation, investment documentation with the investor, you forget to carve out personal assets from your liabilities. Indemnification clause, please make sure to carve out and say that the promoters are not in any event be liable, or their personal assets are not going to be attached tomorrow if a liability comes on them. Over to you, Kamran.
Right. So, Harshita, we've seen instances where personal assets have been attached, but there has to be some glaring incidents of negligence, the glaring incidents of fraud, and the case can not only just be under Companies Act. Typically, when the element of fraud or gross negligence or willful misconduct is involved, there are other statutes which come into place. For example, PMLA. For example, your criminal code. So as and when these statutes get applied, it gives power to the regulators to also go after the assets of the person. We've seen examples of a recent example could be like a case of Sterling Biotech, where assets of of about 5,000 crores were seized by the enforcement directorate of the promoter directors. In terms of what could be the do's and don'ts for the directors who are all sitting on the board, including the managing directors, I think one important aspect is to acquire and understand the operations of your business. It will never be a defense, that you were not aware of what your company was doing. Secondly, you will have to ensure that all committees that you formed, all the departments that you formed in the company are working properly and are doing their job. You will also have to check for qualifications in auditor reports. You have to you've got to put in place multiple checks and balances in the system and see that those checks and balances are working properly from time to time. And if you are, let's say, an investor director, it is very important to record your dissent in a board meeting, in the minutes of the meeting, because typically liability will be fastened on you through board process, attributing the knowledge to you. So those were some of the do's, Harshita, that the directors can and to protect themselves from liability.
Sure. I think, Kamran, before we log off and end this session for today, one last question, if you could take from Parag. I think it says, if a fraud is being done stealthily by management, which is unknown to an executive director, can the director still be liable for the fraud, like in the case of Satyam? I think while we discuss the Satyam case, maybe it could be good to repeat it.
Right. Yeah. So, again, if it is being deliberately, shrugged, or hidden, concealed from the board, then the board can obviously say, then at least the non-executive directors obviously have a defense that it was always outside their knowledge. But for an executive director to say that it was outside his knowledge is not a good defense, because an executive director is supposed to have acquired sufficient knowledge and information, and is expected to act diligently, ensure that the checks and balances are working properly, ensure that the financial statements presents a true and fair picture of the company. So to an extent, if there is a fraud, non-executive directors may have a defense, but an executive director will have to be careful and apply his mind and act very diligently in things like these.
Sure. I think to the extent possible, I think we've answered almost all the questions. If there's anything still which remains, the participants can feel free to get in touch with us on on unanswered questions, and we'll get back offline. We're almost done with this session. The time. So over to you, Khaled, for any for informing the participants about the next sessions for the day.